Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and we look forward to using the fruits of your research. For ECRE as a civil society alliance, it's essential to have access to a solid academic research, and so we appreciate what comes out of this kind of multi-university research project. I've been asked to address the question of, do European asylum procedures meet the protection and burden sharing requirements of the GCR? And I'll divide my comments into three parts. Firstly, looking at some of the requirements in the GCR, and then what is the EU position and response and tools available when it comes to meeting those requirements. Secondly, a few comments on the political choices being made in Europe that, in our view, undermine the GCR and the principles and policies it recommends. And then I'll just conclude with a few reflections that are more forward-looking. Is this likely to change or not? In the absence of the European Commission, I've taken the liberty of looking not just at the procedures piece, but looking at the common European asylum system as a whole, which was going to be addressed by the Commission, but I think it makes more sense to look at the full SEAS plus related measures, primarily funding. So, coming to the question of those requirements of the GRF, our sort of headline conclusion would be that the EU's, the European Union's legal and financial tools do allow it, in theory, to meet the requirements of the Global Compact on Refugees. That position is something we've been arguing over the last year, including in a short paper we put out. Our line has been that the Global Compact on Refugees, we use the tagline there, global means global, that this is also something that should be implemented in Europe, rather than being something that Europe supports other regions to do, or Europe provides money for other regions to do. So, and we believe that if you look at the legal framework and the related implementing tools such as money, Europe could take forward and implement internally the requirements set out in the GCR. The question then is about the policy choice. So to give some examples, looking at the GCR and the requirements that are set out there. If we move to, aside from the principles set out at the beginning, if we then look at the substance in the compact, it starts with the reference to the forum that Sophie has very well described. This is also something where Europe has the tools and the mechanisms to respond. It has been managing resettlement programmes over a number of years, and what we saw in Geneva was the pledge of 30,000 places. And I would say our position on this is that we would want to see a massive expansion in the acceptance of people through safe and legal channels, because it should be about Europe doing its fair share of responsibility. At the same time, we have to be careful. Any numbers are good. I mean, anybody who is resettled, anybody who has the opportunity to arrive at protection through a safe and legal route is something positive. At the same time, the principle of the compact is fair sharing of responsibility globally. So there are lots of calculations, of course, from UNHCR, also from some of our members like IRC, who put out their suggestions as to what would be a fair number for Europe. We would add to that we want to see the support from the EU to the member states to make sure it happens. The money is there. We just published a report last week that we carried out jointly with UNHCR, which looked at the use of EU funding to incentivise resettlement from outside Europe and to incentivise relocation within Europe. And one of the conclusions there is that there's a great potential to use the money to increase numbers. And you can see the specific recommendations there. One of our recommendations is also about earmarking EU funding, because if it's not a rule, let's say, that funding should be used for some of these positive measures, it will be used by the member states with the Commission's encouragement for other measures, such as, I was going to say detention, but that would of course be illegal, restriction of movement and deportation. And in our wider analysis of EU funding, we saw certain member states that were spending 90% of their AMIF, their EU funds for asylum, migration, integration, on restriction of movement and deportation. So it's about making sure that the money is used in a good way. If we move down from, the final point I would just add is to emphasise, as Sophie says, on resettlement. We're talking about resettlement, complementary pathways, which in some cases may not provide the long-term solution that resettlement does. However, what we see within Europe is that certain countries may be reluctant to engage in resettlement, but may be open to other forms of safe and legal channel. And as a way to get them into the practice of using safe and legal channels, student scholarships, private sponsorship, the humanitarian corridors work may be ways to bring in certain member states. And it is a small success in some ways. There are 23 of the 27 member states who have some programme of either resettlement or complementary pathways. Related to this and outside the scope of the GCR is of course the need for legal migration routes for the non-asylum migration piece, which for us does go hand in hand with the question of ensuring asylum functions in Europe. And with that, the even more contentious question of regularisation, which given the numbers has to be part of the picture and not a taboo, even though we understand the reality of having politicians speak up in favour of regularisation. What we see, in fact, is small-scale regularisation programmes under the radar, which can be very effective. Moving down to some of the other GCR requirements. The second points look at national comprehensive mechanisms, the CRRF approach, support platforms, regional and sub-regional approaches. And the idea that UNHCR had from the beginning that this would be an operational tool to deal with situations of large-scale movement. Here, I think there's really been a missed opportunity to test and apply some of these comprehensive refugee response frameworks in Europe. And we, along with others, including UNHCR, argued for there to be pilots of the GRRF approach in Europe. Greece being one possible example. The situation in the Mediterranean, the central Mediterranean route, could also have been an approach. Actually, in theory, Europe should be able to mount its own collective response to some of these situations, but the international framework could still have been helpful. Moving down, the GCR also talks about funding. Here, I would just reiterate the points that I made earlier. EU funding can support the right to asylum within Europe, but it's a question of earmarking the funding so that it goes into asylum capacity development, integration, and not just focuses on the third priority of return, which there is a temptation to do. The other elements, I'm sort of following the order of the GCR here, the multi-stakeholder and partnership approach. This is something that many are committed to, that many find hard to put into practice. From ECRE's side, we've tried to interpret this as something we include in our advocacy, yes, but above all as something that we practice. And for us, that has meant the inclusion of people with a refugee background in all aspects of our work, as board members, as members of the Alliance, as staff members, as experts at our events. And we've made some progress there, but there's still a lot more to do. And in a way, I, as the director of ECRE, I would see progress in those areas almost as more important than if we manage to have advocacy and political outcomes when it comes to that. Moving down, data and evidence collection. This is something that's essential. It's something where there are many gaps when it comes to the information gathered and presented by the EU institutions. We have, to some extent, profited from that, if I may put it like that, by trying to fill the gap with the AIDA database, the Asylum Information Database, where we carry out an assessment of asylum systems in Europe. We find using the evidence that we've gathered and supplementing it with Eurostat or EASO information is crucial for having any sort of evidence-based policy recommendations. This is a perpetual struggle. As you know, this is not an area of policy that lends itself to evidence-based decision-making. However, we refuse to give up on that. I'm told countless times that we're naive to keep referring to evidence, but so long as you believe in the Enlightenment, you will continue to do that. Moving down, the final points in terms of the GCR requirements. There then comes a big chunk of substance on reception and admission. And there I think we can see the Common European Asylum System has many of the answers. If we look at the provisions on reception, qualification, asylum procedures, the law is there that would allow proper fulfilment of international protection requirements in Europe. I would say our concern in recent years has been compliance with these legal standards. We identified 5 key implementation gaps, and our advocacy is focused on getting these implementation gaps filled. I'll return to this in my conclusions, which I'm just coming to. Finally, the whole set of comments or points on rights, meeting needs and supporting communities is very much about the content of protection. And there we see a very mixed picture across Europe. It's not an EU competence, as we know. What member states do on integration varies hugely. Our argument has also been that even though it's not an EU competence, there's a huge amount that EU can still do through funding for integration, through sharing of experience and good practice among the member states, but also through creating a stable and rights-based legal framework. Because without that legal framework, without security of status, for instance, integration outcomes are significantly reduced. So let me conclude then by saying, okay, if the argument is that the standards are there to meet the GCR requirements, why does that not necessarily happen? I think this is to do with policy choices. And here it then becomes a question of using the evidence to try and argue for better policy choices. In recent years, the approach, the strategy of Europe has been based on prevention of arrivals. The so-called externalisation agenda attempts to prevent people accessing territory through the use of external border and internal policies. This approach undermines the GCR, the principles and the policies within it. There are specific elements we would highlight. So, for instance, not focusing on compliance and implementation gaps when it comes to the Common European Asylum System. The 5 implementation gaps we identified are very poor registration, so people who are not being registered, appalling reception conditions in certain member states. The asylum lottery, meaning that poor quality decision making is leading to such a huge divergence in recognition rates that the same Afghan asylum seeker has a 3% chance of being recognised for protection in one country and a 98% chance in another, with no difference in terms of the objective facts of the individual case. Procedural guarantees being systematically ignored. and procedural guarantees including the right to effective remedy. These are not special luxuries for asylum seekers, they're standard parts of any legal process in any area of law. And finally, everything to do with the Dublin regulation and responsibility sharing. So our argument would be focus on compliance, not reform, except for Dublin, where responsibility sharing needs to be reformed. Secondly, interpretation of legal standards and enforcement of court judgments. There are huge problems there. We're involved in litigation. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the key cases in this area. If judgments are not then enforced, we're also seeing a lack of recognition of the standards that the GCR and international frameworks behind it imply. Political priority focused on reform, not compliance. We and many others have just spent the last 4 years dealing with commenting on a set of proposals for reform of the system that didn't address the key problems, that would have introduced even more dysfunction and unfairness, but had to be defensively combated, let's say. Right now we're awaiting new proposals that we fear will also be problematic. And then we have the impact of all of these choices on the rest of the world. Of course, the say-as Europe's measures are about what happens within Europe. But if it chooses not to have a functioning asylum system and instead relies on the rest of the world, this also undermines the wider global implementation of the GCR. So finally, is this likely to continue? I would say it's a mixed picture. We see the new pact on asylum and migration as an opportunity for things to be done differently. We argue that the focus there should be on compliance, not on reform, with the exception of Dublin, start a process of meaningful reform of the responsibility sharing mechanisms. In the short term, move to rights-based compliance, including collective responses when people are arriving, and ad hoc short-term relocation mechanisms to deal with and mitigate the unfairness of the responsibility sharing mechanism. We see some positive language from the new commissioners and some worrying developments. There's a strong fear that we're going to get a new legislative proposal which is focused on containment at the borders with what we call the border instrument of near mandatory use of border procedures and rapid return. And then finally there's what happened last week, where we saw, instead of a collective European response to a manageable situation, we again saw a panic and an inappropriate, damaging military-style response to, in relative terms, a small number of the 12 million who've been displaced from Syria crossing the border. So we put out a statement last week which urged an alternative approach, as did many others. So it's the usual thing. There are positive alternatives. The political choice can be made, but we just need both the evidence, the advocacy, and the continued pressure to try and get those choices. Thank you.